and very aggressively asked Joshua Bol, who was the writer, that why did you bring this play now? When you know it's all over and everything, it doesn't happen. Huh? So you take an intention as if you are taking revenge of doing that. So he quietly listened to all the accusations and made one statement which is so well said and written in my head. He said, while writing this play and writing about concentration camps, I referred to so many books because I wanted it to be very authentic. But when it came to portray the Nazi officer, I didn't refer to anything else but myself within. Because all of us have positive and negative emotions, and because of social code of conduct, we either choose a way of decently expressing it or not expressing it. But in a film or theater, you get a license to express your negative emotions without being punished for it. And so once you have done with your negative emotions, probably it is easier for you to be good in your personal life.
So you mean the villains are the best people in real life? You're getting a sense of that already.
Very
Mohan.
true. There are so many bad people playing good in Hindi films. And there are very few good people who play bad. I am one of them. Yeah, right.
So fantastic. So, this book deals with pre-independence to right up to 2019, is I think 2021, which is the last film you referred to.
Mumbai Saga.
So you've dealt with a lot of villains.
Yes.
So then let me ask, just one second.
You speak, I'll eat.
Okay.
You speak, I eat. Now I have permission. Being a villain, I can. Right now, take it.
Sorry. So you've dealt with a lot of villains in this book. So the only question to ask is, in the book, कितने आदमी थे?
50 लोगों को तो इंटरव्यू किया था मैंने, और लगभग 300 फिल्में तो देखी होंगी, और कई फिल्में कई बार देखी हैं बारीकी से कि वो सीन में क्या कह रहा है. फॉर एग्जाम्पल राखाल बाबू इन ममता, उसकी विलेनी क्या है? वो आके अपनी बीवी को कहता है कि तुम यहाँ एक मुजरे वाली बन गई हो तुम, हाँ, बट आई विल सू यू ऑन ग्राउंड्स ऑफ रेस्टिट्यूशन ऑफ कॉन्जुगल राइट्स. So the very specific point on which he's blackmailing her, that becomes his villainy. It's not about the fact that he's coming and asking for money as a bribe to keep his mouth shut. He's saying, I refer to this, but itna padha likha hai ki he's able to refer to a particular clause. But that's his act of villainy. So I really had to watch these movies very closely. It was based on outside-in assessment, based on the interviews and then a lot of archival material. And then watching the movies very carefully, because there's a lot that you learn from watching. For example, sir, आपका role इसमें गंगा जल में, उसका मैंने उल्लेख किया इसमें.
You're there.
You're there.
Oh, photo nahi.
Photo nahi hai mera.
Your villainy was too, you were hiding in plain sight. So yes, speaking of unka photo nahi hai, the people whose photos are there, we'll come to that later. The first thing I wanted to ask is the structure of the book. You could have taken two routes. One is to go from the pre-independence era to 2021 and, to kind of calibrate the changing face of the villain. But you've chosen another route, which is a thematic route. Like first the Deshdrohis, how they changed from the British to the Chinese during the Chinese aggression to the Pakistanis now, and also the enemy within through terror. Then you go into the psycho villains. We'll come to that with you later. Then the dacoits and the outlaws. So what made you choose this thematic villainy rather than...
What I had to sketch in mind after a lot of deliberation was a two-way matrix. That is, you line up all the categories on one axis and you line up the decades in the other axis, and then you do a match. Now, there are certain genre of villainy that has
He's an
existed.
engineer, if you're wondering why this would be the way forward. But yes,
कभी तो काम आएगा ना पढ़ाई.
yes, to write a book on villains. Yes, that's
So
right.
there are certain genre which have existed across all decades, like British as villains, perennial, ekdam evergreen theme hai. But there are certain things which have existed or come into existence only. For example, smugglers as villain. They came only in the 70s, late 60s, maybe starting from Jewel Thief, and then into the 70s. And then they vanished after the 70s, because what came at the 80s is the local Mumbai mafia, because that's what was happening. So it had to be a mix and match of genre and the decade, right? So again, having arranged it by themes, what you said, by category, it also had to follow a logical, chronological. For example, what if I had put the Dhoom Machale chapter right at the beginning of the book? Because that came in 2000s, the Dhoom series and all the techno thieves and the Indrajal comics wala themes, right? That if I had put that at the beginning of the book, it's like, kya shuru kar raha hai? So it had to start right from the beginning. So uske second level pe bhi ek chronology tha usme.
Okay.
It has started with the British as the villains in the pre-independence and then post-independence, and then go on to the other forms of foreigner villainy like Pakistanis, Chinese, and all that.
So, there is one particular part of this book which is about the psychopaths and the crazy villains, psychotics, basically. So, one of the most famous negative roles played in this genre is Shah Rukh Khan in Dar. We are talking about commercial cinema. And there are he's talked about other people, but this is one of the iconic ones. When you see these deviants and the stalking and psychologically, deranged people in Hindi cinema, now to put on your other hat as somebody who's trained in this field of mental health, how do you assess the portrayal in Hindi cinema of these villains? Let's start with Shah Rukh Khan's Kaka
No, for
Kiran.
me, I'm really torn between the two. And many times in such conferences I have to speak when a lot of people, particularly lawyers, accuse filmmakers that a lot of bad things happening in society is because the way you portray them in the films, and which gives a kind of an impetus for other people. This has particularly become a hot topic when there was many instances of using acid to burn the faces, especially one-sided love. One-sided love, and even till today, you have these kind of characters. And these are personality disorders, I would say. They're not necessarily psychopaths, but personality disorders. Psychopaths are basically antisocial only, right? Like when I played in Trimurti, a lot of people ask me, how did you accept the role? I accepted the role because it was a very different kind of villain. It was not the routine thing of kidnapping women, drinking a lot. And it was a kind of a spiritual villain who has more power of Mahakali, that kind of thing, and rule over. So, I liked the way you have categorized them and the way you have done, particularly. And one of those could be personality disorder. Like in this, there is a personality disorder. And in such seminars, it really becomes problematic because thing they claim, the filmmakers, see what we portray is also taken from the society. But what is a minor or statistically insignificant number from which the creative writers pick it up, after it is filmed, it becomes a rebound and more. That becomes a terrible. Because they take only the dramatic aspect of such instance without going the psychological impact of it. And I do remember once me and Mahesh were on the same dais. And the big client, Mahesh said, look, our job is to entertain. And we will use everything with which we can entertain. And obviously, like we said, we all have negative characters. And when we show it or you see it on the screen, many of us feel good because, oh, he's like that, I am not like that. That's one way. And that is what actually Bergman has written, not in the context of villains, but in the context of depression. When he made Face to Face film and wrote a letter to his crew and cast why he's making a film. There he gives three categories or three reasons that people identify with films. And so if they also have the same problem, they feel it is shared and they feel little better, that they are not the only one, and it is shared. So they may benefit from analysis of such characters in the film, like in Face to Face. The second group of people he gives is, there are people who like to measure their greatness by the wretchedness of other people. Now, this is in the second category. As I told you, that, oh, he's so bad, I am not like that. This is a satisfaction to you. And the third reason he said, if you don't understand anything in the film, everybody likes to see good faces, good camera work, good acting, good music and everything. So that is also a good reason to see the film. So even villainy, if it's made beautifully shown, it likes. And now that I remember, before I forget, I'll tell you. The first time I really played, in Nishant only, we kidnap her and we throw her, Shabana, in the house. And Anant and me both rape her. Right. That, the first shot of that scene, I lost all my interest in raping. The reason is because the first shot was okay, we throw her. And she's on the floor looking at, my God. And then second shot was from our point of view, right, camera, which he took, right, the cameraman. So actually we were not required. So what was the fun? But then, Shabana even tells today that how people just sometimes. The moment that was over, I was the first one to give hand to Shabana to get up from there. And she said, that was the time I knew you were a good man. Thanks.
Great. So coming back to Face with the villains here, there's an interesting story about how one of the iconic villains is Mocambo. We will end with the most iconic one, but let's talk about Mocambo right now. Mogambo, right? So Mogambo was supposed to be played by another actor before Amrish Puri took it on. So can you just talk us through that whole, briefly about that, the other actor and how he got the role and what he did?
Okay, that's a spoiler, but okay, I'll share it.
Some spoilers are allowed.
Yeah. Anupam Kher was originally supposed to play that role. Yeah. And about more than 50% of the film had been shot. But then Amrish Puri, maybe because of the way he played the role in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, so that had a very close sort of a connection with that, then he was brought in. And then he did the role, and obviously he did that exceedingly well. And when I interviewed Mr. Anupam Kher, he was the quintessential gentleman. He said, the way Mr. Puri played the role, I couldn't have played the role. I think it was the right choice, right? Because Mogambo is a guy who's dangerous and funny at the same time, right? He does all sorts of villainy. If you look at it from black marketing to extortion to throwing people out of their homes and kidnapping children, only thing it doesn't do is misbehave with women. That's the only thing it doesn't do. Otherwise, he wants to blow up the world, he wants to fly a rocket, sab kuch karna hai usko, right? But there is something about him, his gaudy dressing and his pompous way of talking, addressing himself in the third person, making people, do that hail Mogambo, whatever. There's something, the subtext about him is something funny. Okay, he's a guy, who wants to be respected for whatever he does. So that's why somehow it brought the crowd and the children and all the fun and laughter along with the character. In my opinion, it was a mix of two characters in the comics we have read. There was this guy called Cobra in the Mandrake the Magician series who wants to rule the world. He's got a mad desire to rule the world. And then this character called Rastapopolo in Tintin. Okay, again, the big nose and all that. So he seemed to be a mix of that. So I think it was a wonderfully, very imaginatively crafted character. And it really worked. And Anupam Kher was the first to concede that I think the switch was the right choice to make. And that story is there in the book.
Okay.
And there are many other stories in the
There
book.
are several stories. There are so many stories that we'll have to have many sessions. You spoke about the changing face from the smuggler to the... So you spoke to Hussain Zaidi, who is this author of many books about Dawood, and even the current blockbuster film Gangubai is based on his book Mafia Queens of Mumbai. So what did he have to say about the influence of real underworld in the 80s and 90s on Hindi cinema?
He gave some amazing insights. He said, Balaji, gangsters and mafia are not one and the same, though we use the terms interchangeably. Arun Gawli is a gangster because he was caught and put into jail. Mafia वो होता है जो कि पकड़ा नहीं जाता है. Nobody has been able to capture Dawood Ibrahim, though if you Google, you might even find his address. But nobody has been able to capture him. He's mafia, right? Because they became part of the mainstream. And the other thing he shared is, mafia is never into terror financing, right? Which is why the film Black Friday, I initially categorized it under mafia. Then after I met Hussain Zaidi, I removed it from there and put it under the foreigner category of villains because it was terror exporting. It was imported terror, someone from Dubai controlling it. Maybe who else, I don't know. But it was not Dawood. And Hussain said, I've spoken to Dawood once, and he said, मैं कैसे कर सकता हूँ? अरे मेरा धंधा तो मुंबई में चलता है, मैं अपना धंधा खराब करूँगा क्या? बम लगा के मुझे क्या फायदा होगा? He said, we mafia guys are businessmen. You are above the line, we are below the line. That's the only difference. Why should I blow up my own shop? So that's why, based on his insights, and that was also one of the things that went into the research in terms of fine-tuning the categorization, getting it absolutely right. So these were some of the insights that I get from Hussain Zaidi in reading his books and also interviewing him.
So would you say, I'll throw this question to both of you, that of course the Hindi film industry is the Mumbai film industry as well, that for instance Nishant and Ankur and a different landscape for human interface between good, evil, poverty, exploitation was shown. I mean, it's not your mainstream cinema, but they are films we still remember. So do you think there's this great divide in the way evil is shown in Hindi mainstream films and a more nuanced version of issues are shown in, what was the alternative cinema of the 70s and even a bit of the 80s?
I'm not as brilliant as an academician like Balaji is. So, forgive me, but there's an element of truth in what you say. And I would like to quote a very sophisticated, nice example of showing the shades of the society and not of the person in villainy. Normally, to make it dramatic in popular cinema, many of the characters are portrayed as black and white, and very few are portrayed as human beings. And now I make reference to Manekda's film Sadgati. Because there, if you see the initial part of the film, you don't feel that one is villain and the other, one is exploiter and one is exploited. it is so accepted in the film that right from the first scene where Om is taking the leaves to make a thali for the Brahmin who would come home to find an auspicious day, he is also instructing his wife and the daughter, make it, put it and don't touch it. Knowing that before going to Gashiram's house. Going there also he has taken something for the animals to eat. Okay. And then the way the Brahmin speaks to him, not what is irritation, but not anger. Irritation. You know. And when he says that, please find out a good auspicious day for my daughter's wedding. He says, कुछ काम नहीं क्या मैंने दूसरा? अच्छा ठीक है, मेरा काम होने के बाद मैं आऊँगा. He doesn't say no. He knows he has to do it. But meantime, he says, now that अब मुझे टाइम है, तो बैठे बैठे कुछ काम नहीं करते क्या? ये साफ करो, वो साफ. And he doesn't feel that is anything wrong in it. He does that. The whole villainy in a kind of a hidden manner begins when he asks him to cut that loft of wood. Where actually again his wife tells him that, right? Now you see, this is what is called culture. One side. They are getting it done, but बीवी पूछती है काक गीता कि सुबह से आया कुछ खाया है क्या उसने? तो इसे तो दे दो ना उसे कुछ. बोलती ज़्यादा नहीं, मैं 2 बार चावल है तो. Then he says, उससे क्या होगा? उससे बेहतर है कुछ मत दो, घर जाके खाना खा. That is why seeing the film carefully is so important. And then he asks to cut that wood. And obviously because he has not eaten, there is a reference in the beginning also. Smita tells him before he goes, कुछ खा के जाओ. And he says, मैं वापस आने के बाद खाऊंगा. So it's very, very clear that he has just recovered from kind of a fever and is a bit weak and everything. On top of that, he has not eaten. On top of that, when he goes, he is doing a lot of house chores. On top of that, now he has been asked to cut wood. But he doesn't feel like that. He says he has to do something because... And the only act he can resort to is have ganja. So when that gaud comes, we say, चिलिम है क्या? चिलिम घर में आता है, to ask for light, and then it throws light at him. So you see gradual build-up of that, and which goes to climax when, while cutting the wood, Dukhi dies. Now comes the cultural climax of that, and untouchable is dead in the Brahmin's house. And they have to remove Swal. So he goes there. From the meantime, Gowda has gone and said, this is a police thing, so don't go. So he knows obviously nobody is going to come and pick him. So when he comes back, all the Brahmins have gathered together, कि ये तुम कब हलाओ? When will you take this off? Because we can't use the road. And he's upset. So this is how deep-rooted culture is. That. And that is also the question came last time, conversion of a story written in words, converting that story into visuals. That last shot of Shodgati, where the Brahmin has a noose, which he puts without touching him, and drags that body outside the village, where you see the skulls of dead animals, as put it. So this villainy doesn't appear as villainy, because here both there is social acceptance, cultural acceptance. So this is a nuanced depicting to make you aware that you also have bad elements in you. Normally they don't come to play, but in crisis situation, you know this is like a villain. That's it.
Wonderful. So that is one aspect of villainy. Now, we coming back to the more black villains. You have spoken at many points in your book about various, these almost cartoon villains. We spoke about Mocambo. Who, according to you, was the most nuanced villain in Hindi mainstream films of the 70s and 80s you saw, who was sophisticated? Who did you enjoy writing about?
Well, sophisticated, obviously it was Ajit in the 70s.
Yes.
In 50s and 60s and 70s, you had the sophisticated villains. You had the Kane Singh, right?
Yes.
Who was the owner, or typically the owner of a hotel, who ran a casino, right? Nobody looked better than him in a dinner jacket. 60s, you had Pran Saab, right? The suave. But he was not an institutional villain. He was always an individual villain trying to, heroine se shaadi karne ki koshish kar raha hai. 70s was Ajit, the institutional villain who's stealing Nataraj ki murti and selling it to an international gang, right? So he's like the supplier to the smugglers. 80s, there was very little sophistication because it was all based on because the Maharashtra GDP had grown 4 times and so had the crime, extortion, the MLAs getting linked up with the very top bosses. So then it was a very local Mumbai flavored sort of a Hindi he's speaking, like your Nana Patekar, the South Indian, or Sadashivam Rapurkar, right, playing the role of Rama Shetty. That sophistication had gone. It was more of a very local pillion rider, Ghoda, Supari, and all that. So that changed. Somewhere the sophistication came back in the 2000s when you had those, this Dhoom series and all that. These were some of the shades we saw, the changing shades. If you ask what is nuanced, I would refer to maybe the grey ensemble villains. If you look at a film like Parakh, or if you look at a film like Jaagte Raho, where the entire society or the colony consists of all the bad people. Exactly. Sri 420 as well. Yeah, of course, it's very nuanced. Those were the nuanced ones, where there is no apparent villainy, but it's in the subtext.
So you cross into the...
Here, like in Shadgati, nobody is portrayed as a villain. They're all human beings, which all shades. And that is why you can't categorize it into a film where there is a well-portrayed hero and well-portrayed villain. Right.
So have we returned to that period in cinema where there's no well-portrayed hero and well-portrayed villain? Now, if you think of as mainstream as it gets, Dhoom 2, which has Hrithik Roshan as this shape-shifting villain. He in fact won the Best Actor award at the film fair. So he's the hero, yet he's the villain. So, there are no clear-cut boundaries. In fact, right through the movie, I think Abhishek looks even more grumpy than he normally looks. So it's very, very hard to tell whether he is really the one we should be rooting for. And Hrithik, who's looking like a Greek god and is doing some amazing things, is actually the antagonist. So do you think, again, we've come to areas where, it's not so clear-cut that the villain is the villain and the hero is the hero?
So I'll tell you, the guy who's stealing all this, Hrithik Roshan was the villain. There's no doubt about it. In Dhoom 2, and John Abraham was the villain and Amir Khan was the villain in Dhoom 3. No doubt about it. What these movies did was to correct an unfairness. For example, in the 60s, villain jitna bhi good looking ho, Pran Saab ko, they make him sit on a donkey and make him bray like, ye zabardast si usko nicha dikhana hai, kyunki hero ko acha dikhana hai, right? In these films, the Dhoom series and Players and Cash and all these movies, villain, hero, dono barabari ka mauka diya hai dono ko. Both of you are handsome, both of you can have a level playing field. Now you figure it out, who wants to win, right? So that is where I thought it was the level playing field was created. But that's less of a grey issue than saying both can win, both have an equal chance to win. Where I would talk about the real grey stuff are things like Hazaro Khwaishein Aisi, right? Where there are some characters, if you look at Siddharth Tayyabji, the role that K.K. Menon played. I mean, what do you say? Is he a bad guy? Is he a good guy? He keeps shifting colors. He's doing it for the good of the country.
So is Shiny.
Even Heather.
Even Shiny in Hazaro Khwaishein is a hustler.
He's a hustler. He says, "Na, I'm a pimp. I'm a agent. I'm doing it," right? So I would say the grayness is defined by, as sir correctly said, by the human being, what he is, right? So there are two distinct aspects, and we have tried to cover both in the book in terms of how a human being, there is a grayness within a human being, and there is a level playing field in the screenplay between the characters, which was in the Doom series. So that's where the two angles of grayness comes in.
So the other thing I wanted to ask you is, you know, some of the villainy in Hindi films is just too simplistic. You have, in fact, mentioned some, you know, we are meant to suspend our disbelief and kind of bid farewell to it. For instance, Madan Puri, who's this very well-built, fair, thick-featured Punjabi, has played a Chinese spy in several films. So, you know, sometimes do you despair at the complete simplistic portrayal of the villains over time? There are moments in the book where I read some kind of, you seem a little hairan, to use a Hindi word.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I couldn't believe that Madan Puri can be cast as a Chinese. Okay, I can understand Jeevan maybe being cast as a Chinese. Small built and maybe some bony features. So I can still understand, but I don't know why they do it. But Danny, yes, Danny came later, of course, and Danny played that roles. But yeah, some of it seems too simplistic, too black and white, and too obvious. You know, everything he seems is he's right from the first scene. Usko bataya कि अब तुम खराब आदमी हो, right? And it's like teaching the audience. उसको छोटी उंगली पकड़ के audience को सिखाओ कि बेटा ये अच्छा है, ये बुरा है, ये हाँ. Yeah, but
like this.
You have mentioned that in your psychotic chapter, that, you know, people had these wild laughs, and you've made a very good point that, you know, in the Joker, Joaquin Phoenix's award-winning role, you know his history, you know why he has that laugh, you know he had a childhood that scarred him so deeply that he became this individual. We have no backstories for any of our famous villains. We don't know why Gabbar Singh is the way he is. We don't know why Mogambo wears 5 rings and a pink wig. So do you sometimes worry that, you know, feel that Hindi cinema is woefully underwritten?
They're focused on the behavior, on the antagonistic behavior, and not on the backstory, right? But there are some good films which have focused on the backstory, like Chalte Chalte, Simi Grewal in Chalte Chalte. She had lost her husband, and this guy is a lookalike of her husband, so she believes he's her husband reincarnated, and she has to get him. That's what drives her villainy. Or Kajol in Gupt. She has had this problem from the childhood. She has had a problem of anger management. There's a medical history. There's a condition, which is why, you know, she doesn't, for her, it's not about the act of killing. It's about what it is. Okay? Or Shah Rukh Khan in Dar. He has lost his mother. He's a motherless, sick boy, right? And he's speaking to his mother who's dead on the phone. Baat kar rahe wo. So there are some classy films which have focused, or even this, you know, Agni Sakshi, Nana Patekar.
Nana Patekar.
He has had a traumatic childhood, and many of them, these in the psychotics, they've had traumatic childhoods. Okay.
Psycho was the first Hitchcock film where there is a analysis of the bad person was given, and this mother fixation and using this. Only after that, because all said and done, to be very honest, we rarely write fresh scripts. But we Indianize it so well that you should not suspect. But many of them are directly picked up from the Western thing. So all those villains which you have described now are really post-psycho, where there is a reason for them to become like that.
Yeah, there is a reason.
Okay, so that's another interesting point. Have you written about the influences? You have mentioned a couple of influences of English films which have inspired villains in...
Absolutely. Vulture is a Patient Bird is from where Shalimar was inspired. Or Seven Samurai and Magnificent Seven. वहाँ तो line लगा दी है. Your Sholay, Shor Machaye Shor, then your Khote Sikke, then, you know, everything kept coming. So because it was such a... And somewhere it had a very strong connect with Indian things. You know, the Wild West thing was somewhere similar to the Indian villages and some people landing up. Acha. But what I couldn't explain is in this film called Wanted, Mitunda ka movie जो है, that इसमें in an Indian village, you know, people are wearing jeans and big hats and the Stetson hats. क्यों भाई? Right? Or people riding horses in the middle of the road. गाड़ी चल रही है, yellow taxi running and there's a horses. Why would anyone do that? So sometimes adaptation becomes so literal that it's sometimes not very funny.
So, before I throw it to the audience, very briefly, Balaji, do you think, since Sir brought up Anthony Perkins and Norman Bates, is India still waiting for its truly scary Norman Bates, or is it there already?
No, some of it is already there. For example, Aks. I would say, Chehron mein kya hai, right? One resembles the other and the character. So there have actually been some very good of the psychological thrillers, just that we need more of it. What happens is there's so much money at stake that maybe filmmakers are scared of making such a film. They'd rather spend that money on an item number to at least recover the money they have put in. But if finance were not to be a problem, I can say that, you know, filmmaking, for example, films like Aligarh, right? Naam Shabana or Baby, or Matrubhumi. Classy films, classy. Matrubhumi is also very similar to Sadgati, कि वहीं होता ही है वैसे होता है कि हर बच्ची जो जन्म लेती है उसको दूध में डुबो के मार दिया जाता है. And it's not even considered a crime like in Sadgati. But the fact is, commercial, it plays an angle, it plays in the minds of the filmmakers, and that's why we don't get too many of it.
In fact, I've been dying to play a villain, good villain, where at the end of the film, audience is in question whether he was really a villain or he was not a villain. Portal, that's how actually villainy happens many times, including. And such kind of well-integrated villains in the culture, I have yet to see, particularly in Hindi films. In some Marathi films are there.
Correct. Marathi. But I would say post 2000s, there have been a lot of nuances, a lot of better shades, a lot of richer shades, a lot of more balance that has come in, a lot of more maturity in the filmmakers that have come in, because maybe even the audience is a bit more mature. I would say things have changed for the better.
Information. They get a lot of information, more, which earlier they didn't get.
And they're exposed to international cinema as well. I mean,
right.
once you see a film like Parasite is possible, you know that everyone is grey in that film. Everyone's black at some point, but everyone's always human. Now, is there any, are there questions?
When you think for the questions,
There's a question right in front. Sir, can we start with someone else? Hello, can you just give it to somebody new? We'll come back to you, sir. Yeah. There's a gentleman in front. In front.
priority should be given to a villain.
Whoever asks the first question is a villain. Okay, fair enough.
सर इट्स अ प्लेजर आप लोग यहाँ आए आप बहुत डिस्टिंग्विश हमारे सारे गेस्ट हैं एंड थैंक्स फॉर कमिंग टू रांची इट्स अ प्लेजर फॉर ऑल ऑफ अस बहुत ज़बरदस्त सब्जेक्ट आप लोगों ने सेलेक्ट किया बालाजी के लिए भी बहुत धन्यवाद मोहन जी आप आए हमारे लिए बहुत सौभाग्य की बात है मेरा प्रश्न ये है सर हम लोगों के बीच में जैसा आपने कहा कि सबके भीतर एक विलन छुपा हुआ है कहीं ना कहीं और हम लोग आज के डेट में जब सोशल मीडिया इतना स्ट्रांग है सभी तरह के ओपिनियंस आते हैं हमारे पास कुछ साल पहले मैंने देखा कि लोग कह रहे हैं कि साहब रावण जो है रावण भी बहुत ज़बरदस्त आदमी था उसने अपनी बहन की नाक किसी ने काट दी साहब उसने लड़ाई कर ली उसके साथ उसने उसकी वाइफ उठा ली मतलब अब वो भी एक्सेप्टेबल है हर्षद मेहता वाज वेरी मच एक्सेप्टेबल संजय दत्त खलनायक बनते हैं लोग पसंद करते हैं उसको मोहन जी से विशेषता ये सवाल है कि समाज में विलेनी कह लीजिए उसको या अपने भीतर की विलेनी कह लीजिए मतलब एक बुरा व्यवहार या एक बुरा व्यवहार जो है विलन एसेंशियली बुरा है कहीं ना कहीं गलत है वो एक्सेप्टेड हो रहा है मैं जस्ट यही पूछना चाहता हूं सर कि फिल्मों के माध्यम से अब हम कहाँ खड़े हैं
देखो फिल्म का या थिएटर का उद्देश्य ये है अगर संघर्ष नहीं होगा तो फिल्म चलती नहीं और संघर्ष कैसे हो सकता है? उससे ही हो सकता है ना. एक पहले तो रॉबिन हुड के ज़माने में there was open challenge or sword were there. Yeah, villain. So that was a kind of a dignified badness, you can say. One willing, both of us willing for the same woman. And like good men, we decide that let's fight, and the one who wins will get the girl. Right? So that is not called villainy. But now with the change in society, we have these kind of, so frankly speaking, this kind of analysis is good as an intellectual game for me. But in terms of realistic appraisal, because I'm going to suggest him also another good theme, suicides in Indian cinema.
Okay. Sure.
How many varieties are there and what, very interesting. I made a presentation on that with clips right from Ek Duje Ke Liye se leke, Garam Hawa, Pyasa, right?
Okay.
So
should I take another question then? Yeah.
हेलो सर, मेरा क्वेश्चन है सर से कि
Where are you? आप कहाँ हैं? हाँ.
यस सर, मेरा क्वेश्चन ये है कि कबीर सिंह जैसे कैरेक्टर्स को जब हम आसपास के समाज में देखते हैं तो उसे विलन के तौर पे देखते हैं, बट फिल्म में उसे एक हीरो के तौर पे दिखाया जाता है, पोर्ट्रे किया जाता है, और समाज लोग भी उसे, मास पॉपुलेशन भी उसे एक्सेप्ट करती है. तो इसे आप किस तौर पे देखते हैं?
That's a good question. This Shahid Kapoor's Kabir Singh.
Kapoor.
Remember that Arjun Reddy the remake, yeah. So he's villainous, he drinks hard, he slaps the girl. It was a big controversy that he was still the hero of the film.
I think it was a bit of a Devdas sort of a film, right?
Devdas on steroids more than whiskey.
Devdas on steroids. I think he had negative shades. Obviously, some of his acts are villainous, no doubt about it, but maybe there was a desperation driving him to do that. Okay? Again, if they had shown the mental condition, why is he being driven to such a thing, right? Maybe it would have given more credibility to the script. See, देवदास के बारे में पूछना नहीं चाहते because वो रो रहा है बैठ के और दारू पी रहा है, right? वो थप्पड़ नहीं मार रहा किसी को. But the minute it gets down to physical violence, it makes more sense to build a backstory.
In this case, they have, because I happen to have had the misfortune of seeing the film. So there is a bit of a backstory.
Oh,
and the
I've forgotten about it.
backstory
I've forgotten about the
yeah,
film.
you are very lucky because I found it deeply troubling. His backstory is that he's bad. He has always been bad to women. So
And that's not very uncommon. Like Sangram, Ashok Kumar in Sangram, he was born bad. There was no backstory. He was just born bad, defective production, right?
Yeah.
And आखिर में मर जाता है वो. So if you look at the anti-heroes of the 1950s, they had a backstory. There was a trauma or unemployment or whatever that drove them to that, but except Sangram. So ऐसे हुए हैं कभी कि कोई backstory नहीं है.
Now we can go to the gentleman
Yeah.
who had actually got the mic in
Yeah.
the front. I think that'll have to be our final question.
Right?
In all this melee and such a huge list of villains, where do you place Utpal Dutt in Hindi movie?
Well, depends on which film you're talking about, right? I would say if you have to take about, say, The Great Gambler, right? He's a businessman with a little bit of interest in music. You know, he keeps humming this tune, right? When he gives a command for someone to be bumped off, he suddenly starts humming a tune. So I think Utpal Dutt was so diverse, so multifaceted that it's difficult to really cast him in any one category of villainy. In Ye Desh, he was a politician, right?
Barsat Ki Ek Raat.
Barsat Ki Ek Raat, he was a local sahukar, right? Maybe the only smuggler in dhoti kurta, because normally smugglers are always in suits, right? And so he has played the politician, he has played, he has played the smuggler, and he has played also sort of a mentally slightly deranged person in this film, that Vinod Khanna film, whatever, I don't remember. So, Madan Lal Meghraj, of course.
Yeah, he was the Joy Baba Phelu villain as well.
He's played every category. I mean, it's hard to sort of categorize him in any one sort of a genre.
Okay. Uh, I'll let you get the last question if it's about Gabbar Singh, because we haven't spoken about him and it feels vaguely wrong.
ओके गब्बर सिंह को जिस तरह से हम लोग देखते हैं या रामाधीर सिंह को जिस तरह से देखते हैं तो ये हमें इंसान नहीं नजर आते, हमें लगता है कि एक एलेगरी है, ये एक एलेगरी है, या ये चौधरी हैं या ठाकुर हैं या पूंजीपति हैं या ये एक मलिशियस पॉलिटिशियन का एलेगरी है, लेकिन विलन जो है वो एक इंसान भी तो है। आपको कौन सा विलन हिंदी सिनेमा में लगता है कि एक संपूर्ण इंसान है, विलन होने से पहले भी एक संपूर्ण इंसान अपने आप में है?
सर का कहना है वाल्मीकि, वो भी तो इंसान है। सोचना पड़ेगा, बात करते हैं बाद में। झट से दिमाग में नहीं आ रहा है।
Okay, so thank you. You've left the author with more questions. Hopefully, he'll write. Yes. So thank you so much, Balaji. It's an amazing book. It is so detailed that one actually doesn't know where to start and end. Do buy the book. It's available at the bookstore, and you will really enjoy it, because there's nothing more pure and wonderfully enjoyable than the evil in Hindi cinema. Thank you so much, Mohanji, and thank you, Balaji.
Thank you.
Honey, on that.